Welcome, Brett, to the fourth episode of ACF podcast. How are you today?
Fabulous, Mert. It's wonderful to be on again and have the chance to chat about more training and, I don't know, life-related stuff.
I'm really excited as well. So I wanted to talk to you about a specific thing. How do we train for different sports? Why do we train for different sports differently? Or what is the common qualities between these types of training?
It's a great question because there's different mindsets out there, and sometimes depending on who you talk to, they're going to tell you that the routine for athlete X needs to be completely different from the routine from athlete Y, and these could be different positions on the same team. Like they're trying to really get uber specific. So let's go 50,000 foot view, something that would be applicable to all athletes. And so, of course, I also work with functional movement systems, and I'm an FMS practitioner and instructor. And so I believe that for athletes in general, and for, if you're getting out there and training aggressively, even though you might not consider yourself an athlete, you can probably consider yourself an athlete. So number one is movement quality. You need to be able to move well enough to have a positive adaptation to the stress you're going to be placed under. If you look back at the red mats back there, if I were to have the world's best lemon seeds, I don't know, pick a plant. If I were to have the world's best seeds for whatever, and I drop them on that red mat back there, what am I going to get? Dirty mat, right? Nothing's going to grow. Nothing's going to happen. Now, I take a nice pot. I get the right soil in there. I plant those seeds. I water. I fertilize. I get a lemon tree, or whatever your flavor is. I'm stuck on lemon right now because I'm doing a lot of smashed avocados, and lemon goes great with that. So whatever. But we cultivate this little bit of soil so that those seeds can do what they're supposed to do. Well, movement and training is much the same way. If I don't prepare the soil, if I don't clear the restrictions from an athlete, I can run into problems down the road. And so by very quickly setting a movement baseline, using something like the functional movement screen, we check in on ankle mobility, hip mobility, T-spine mobility. We see how your motor control is working. And there's a lot of misperceptions, and there's a lot of some controversy out there about the FMS. I use it purely to get that snapshot of how that athlete is moving in that moment. Because if I want you to be a great sprinter and you have restricted ankles, we're gonna have some problems. If you want to be good at change of directions and being able to cut and have good speed, agility, and quickness, boy, that's a lot easier with the requisite ankle mobility. And you can look at the research when you kind of dive down into it. Ankle mobility, having less than 35 degrees of active ankle dorsiflexion, is a risk factor for injury. And so if we can just check that box right off the bat and do what we need to change that ankle mobility, we can change how that athlete's going to move. Taking that into the training realm, if I want you to front squat, kettlebell front squat, maybe you're doing your iron cardio sequence, that's easier with some ankle mobility. When you don't have the ankle mobility, now we got to compensate. We got to do something different. So as a coach, if I know I've taken the ankle mobility off the table, right, meaning I've improved it to the point where you should be able to squat without problems, and I still see a problem in your squat, I have a better idea that that's a technique thing that I need to coach and cue and maybe give a drill for. If I don't clear the ankles first and I start coaching the squat and you have problems with the squat, now I got to go back and check movement anyway. So why not just do that first? Let's just take that off the table. And even for the people that, feel kind of controversial or, don't use the FMS. If you ask them, they're going to say ankle mobility is important, that hip mobility is important, that motor control is important, that T-spine mobility is important. Like, these are just fundamental things. So that from that 50,000 foot view, let's just say movement quality matters, and we should be doing things to improve that.
Mm-hmm. So movement quality can be described as mobility, coordination, and balance. And would you add any more components to that?
I would say that it's an interesting question, because each one of those pieces could be picked apart into different aspects. Because when we talk balance, which is an interesting thing all by itself, we could be talking vestibular function. We could be talking muscular coordination, or intra and intermuscular coordination. A lot of a restricted ankle, a weak foot, all of these things could impact what we would call balance. And we tend to boil balance down into this idea of standing on one leg. Well, a higher level form of balance is your ability to lose your center of mass, go get it, and bring it back. So this is the stumble. This is the fall, right? That's avoided, where you take a push. Let's say you're on the pitch and somebody comes running in, and boom, you take that hard shot, and boom, you're getting ready to fall, boom, but you make that dynamic step and bring your center of mass back, and you're able to continue in the game without rolling around on the ground. So balance becomes this pretty high level thing, because, like I said, vestibular system, your ability to produce power. And this is where, slight side venture, but this is where power training has become very popular with the elderly or senior populations, where fall mitigation is a high level priority, because a senior citizen's number one fear is falling. Yeah. Number two is not being able to get up. So we'll talk more about that later. But so that ability to produce enough power to respond to that loss of center of mass and bring it back is somewhat a higher level thing. Now, a restricted ankle, not being able to make that step, and I use the ankle as a repeated example just because it's easy. We could be having the same conversation at the hip. We could be having the same conversation, if I can't get into that ankle, even though I was able to make the more dynamic step to try to save my center of mass, but now I can't flex into that ankle and absorb force, I could still topple. And so the movement quality, that just checking that baseline and having that movement quality so that I can move the joints to a requisite level. For example, at the ankle, we look for greater than 35 degrees of active ankle dorsiflexion. Is good enough. Now we kind of drop down into the 30,000 foot view, and we say strength matters. So my first step with all athletes, 50,000 foot view, movement quality. 30,000 foot view, strength matters. And so you need to be strong enough to be powerful. You need to be strong enough to respond to a perturbation. And so that keeping it in that order for me has always made sense and done well for the athletes that I've worked with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And how do you approach strength? How do you assess strength in the first place? And then
it's a really interesting question, because you can get into some traditionally, when we think of testing strength, we would maybe think more in the direction of 1RM testing, a max weight deadlift, squat, bench. If you're in an Olympic lifting program, you'd be going for a max clean or a max, snatch or clean and jerk. And so there's some different ways to go about that. Anytime you're testing and pushing for a max weight, you are incurring a level of risk, right? Because there's a chance that that weight that you're going after is just heavy enough beyond your abilities to where there's a risk of something bad happening. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt, cut the sleeves off, mow grass in it. That was how I did my L5S1 disc and ended up having back surgery in 2003. I had been on a very aggressive deadlift routine, figured I'd go ahead and max my squat so that I could start a squat routine without having squatted in X number of like months or a couple of years. And the guy that was spotting me was like, yeah, you didn't go deep enough. And that I hit 405, not having squatted in, you know, a few years. And then he's like, oh, you didn't go deep enough. So I went deeper on the next one. Yeah, through my back and kapow, and ended up having back surgery 6 months later. So max testing brings with it a level of risk. So when I'm training an athlete for whom being on the field, being present for practice, working on those skills that they need in their sport, I de-emphasize 1RM testing. That's not exactly where I'm going to go to test. I will almost test their strength over time rather than in the moment. Now, are there some proxies that we can look at? Yes. Grip strength. Grip strength actually becomes a pretty good proxy for a lot of kind of overall strength. You could look at something like you could do that with a grip dynamometer. You could do that with a hang from a bar. So just holding a static straight arm hang. You could talk about a flexed arm hang. The motor control screen from the FMS. A farmer's carry test. Now we're getting into what the FMS calls the functional capacity screen, where we start testing postural control, motor control, postural control, impact control, and power production. And that gets into a variety of hops, bounds, farmer's carry, motor control screen. And so I would argue maybe a little bit safer way to start looking at that performance baseline without incurring the risk of a 1RM strength test.
Yeah.
Now, as far as strength testing goes, you know, if we look at the strength we build over the course of an 8 to 12 week program, and we look for changes in the amount of weight used, the RPE comes down, we test a 3RM versus a 1RM. Now we can start setting that baseline. Now, what would I test if we're speaking more specifically about strength? If it's an overhead athlete, I'm going to test a military press, probably kettlebell. I'm going to look for improvements in their getup because that overhead athlete needs to have a strong, stable shoulder to handle the stress of going overhead. I will test some sort of squat, Zercher, kettlebell front squat, something that has a little bit lower risk profile, but still gives me a good idea of lower body strength. Single leg deadlift and deadlift. So, and deadlift is interesting because I will, with some athletes, I will use the swing as a proxy for their deadlift. So I won't push for a 1RM deadlift, but I will look to see that they can swing heavier or swing for, 5 to 6 really powerful repetitions. And if I'm really curious about power production, we could use something like an accelerometer, force plate. You can put numbers to it. At a certain point, though, you also got to trust your coach's eye and just be able to spot the bell's moving faster or it's not, or that's heavy enough to where it got slow. And if it gets slower, it's too heavy because you're no longer being powerful. You're doing, you're doing a fast grind at that point. So that's, and then we got to talk a little bit on lower body. So lower body motor control, single leg hops, different things like that start giving me an idea of where I am strength wise with that athlete. Then we drop down to like the 15,000 foot view. Most athletes who they need to have a level of power. So now we start looking at things like broad jump, vertical leap, some sort of sprinting. So like a flying 10, flying 20, the classic 40-yard dash. Maybe I'm doing a T test to check change of direction. So there's, so as we kind of drop down the layers of what every athlete needs to be good at, movement quality, strength, power, those three things, I think, set an athlete up for pretty good results.
So those would be the basis for almost or all sports. I was going to say almost all, but I think it includes pretty much all sports. I couldn't really think of an exception to these.
I mean, even if let's take a water-based athlete. Let's take a swimmer or a rower. I mean, rowing, you can absolutely see the power, the strength, power, movement quality that needs to be there because of the really extreme positions they get into when they come forward to the stroke. But even a swimmer, their ability to be strong, stable, produce power, they bring that to the water. And so if they don't build it in dry land and enhance it there, it can be, they can leave a piece missing for once they're in the water. Even for something as simple as pushing off the wall, or you want that. Not only do you want that dynamic turn, but once you hit the wall and you push off, you want to be able to push off hard enough and have enough power in that push to really propel yourself and set yourself up well out of that turn. So I think it's an argument that could be made for all athletes, and that's why that kind of three-step process is where I go.
So I think it's very important, the point you made about the 1RM testing. So I want to go into a bit more detail about that. So my speculation, and a layman's speculation, is that a person in general, I observed, that has about 8 to 10 earnest 1RM efforts in their life that their body can handle. And after 8, 10 true 1RM efforts, I think your body is going to start to break down, if not before. Would you like to comment on that speculation?
Yeah, I think that would matter on the time frame of those max efforts. When you look at elite powerlifters who are stepping up on the platform and hitting a 1RM or trying to hit a 1RM in competition, a higher level powerlifter will do that 2 times a year. So they're not maxing every week. So one of the things that you get into is like somebody thinks that every 4 to 6 weeks they need to set a 1RM. Well, in that case, if you're trying to constantly peak and hit a new 1RM in what is really a pretty short time frame, then yes, what you said about having X number within a time frame, and usually doesn't end well when you go for the 9th or 10th one, right? I think that's because of the compression of time there, not giving yourself enough time to recover between those 1RMs. Now, take a very beginning strength trainer, strength trainee, never really done any good strength training before. Their progress chart's going to look like a ski jump, right? It's really quick and fast because they're getting a ton of neural adaptations. They're starting to get the structural adaptations, and woo, they just see this massive and rapid progress. This is also a danger zone because the neurological adaptations and the ability to produce strength and force will outpace the tissue adaptations. So they'll be able to, at a certain point, be able to produce more force than they can handle. Yeah. So you almost have to slow the beginner down a little bit. You still want to go through that, maybe a little lower of a ski jump, not the Olympic, mega ski jump, but you want to be mindful of that. For the strength athlete that has some experience and is really starting to hit a level of strength that 1RM is very neurologically and structurally taxing towards the limits of their genetic ability. And to push genetic ability, you need time. And when you talk to an elite powerlifter and somebody who's getting close to that genetic or whatever max level of strength adaptation, you start looking at gaining 2 to 3% on a lift over the course of a 12 to 24 week time frame. So now, when you're talking about an 800-pound squat, 2 or 3% is still not, still nothing to sneeze at. So it's we're talking about really high level stuff here. But again, that person is going to max in that lift in competition conditions 2 to 3 times out of a year.
Mm-hmm.
And so time frame matters. So like I said, with the 8 to 10 maxes that you were talking about, I think if you compress the time frame and try and do those in a fairly short period of time, even argue 1 year, that's a lot. Now, for the beginning trainee who isn't really at their peak and is continuing to set 1RMs, they can get away with some of that early on. The intermediate to advanced trainee, you got to watch it. You only want to peak every so often. Training is training.
Mm-hmm.
Competition is competition.
Yeah.
If you're trying to peak every time you train, danger.
Yeah.
That is not a great place to be.
Yeah, it feels like American Kickboxing Academy is famous for having their athletes spar super hard. And by the time it comes for the fight, they're very well prepared if they're not injured too much to fight.
Well, and you can look back through some very successful countries that had Olympic lifting programs, and that's kind of one of the easiest examples. But you could make this argument for gymnastics, or you could make it for almost any sport that gets to that level. There are a lot of coaching systems, and I'm going to contrast the Russian system and the Bulgarian system for Olympic weightlifting because I know a little bit about that working with Pavel and his development of Plan Strong. So if you want to take a deep dive into programming and an awesome system of programming, take Plan Strong with Fabio or Hector and look into that. So the Bulgarians had a lot of success winning gold medals in Olympic lifting.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, that athlete who won a gold medal would win 1, maybe 2, and then they were burned out, injured, done.
Mm-hmm.
Because the training was this high volume, intense training approach that, in my opinion, simply identified the athletes that could survive the training. Mm-hmm. And if you could survive the training, you're probably going to be a gold medalist. But you didn't last that long. When you look at the Russian system, what you saw in the Russian system is you had Russian athletes that would win gold medals over 3 and 4 Olympic cycles. 4 Olympic cycles is a 16+ year career of competing at the highest levels of competition. And add 16 years to a 20-year-old, and for Olympic lifting, you're a senior citizen.
Yeah.
Right. For competing at that level. It's the same conversation with tennis. You get into your 30s and people are like, hey, look at the old guy competing at a high level. So the Russian system succeeded not only in producing gold medalists and Olympic athletes, they did it over decades,
mm-hmm.
which is amazing to have the longevity with the strength gains and with the benefits. And I think that's a really important distinction because a lot of training systems operate on identifying people that will be successful at X versus developing people to be successful at
mm-hmm.
X. Military, law enforcement, that's the model. That's boot camp, right? We're going to identify the people that can handle the mental and physical rigors of being a warrior and get them into the whatever branch of service. The problem is, and that's necessary for the military, for law enforcement, that's necessary. You have to know that the person next to you can handle the mental and physical rigors because your life is in their hands.
Mm-hmm.
The person next to you. Gates of Fire is an excellent book by Stephen Pressfield that really kind of hammers that point home if anybody's interested. Now, once you're identified as having the physical and mental qualities that can have you survive, succeed to some degree in those situations, There should be a training system that develops you to be a better soldier, police officer, Olympic lifter, whatever. The problem is most of the training systems continue to simply try to identify people. And to identify people for those things in particular, you're talking about trying to break people. So if you take a training system that's designed to break people and you keep using it, don't be surprised when people break. Versus developing the qualities. Because if we take the military and law enforcement example for just a minute, your ability with hand-to-hand combat and firearms is going to be way more predictive. And actually, there's some research out of the military that your sprint ability is super important to coming home alive from a mission. So the training program should develop speed, firearms efficiency, hand-to-hand combat skills. Why are you still doing 10-mile pukers where you're trying to break everybody? Those aren't the skills that they're going to be needing. So anyway, long-winded answer for this idea of developing capacity, qualities, and the person that you're working with versus simply beating everybody down and finding the 2 people in the room that can survive the training.
I think this is a very eye-opening way of looking at it, and it's a much more systematic approach to finding the right people and then developing them, as opposed to trying to break everyone and take those that are not broken to the next level.
Definitely.
Way more efficient it would be, probably.
And healthier. Let's Coach Mike Boyle, who definitely somebody I look at in the field and follow. He's said, don't tell me about your athletes today. Check in with your athletes 10 years from now. How are they doing? How are they moving? What's happening 10 years from now? That longer term approach, and especially when you look at like high school and college athletes. Yes, we want to have success. Yes, we'd like to win some championships. We want more W's than L's, and all those conversations. But the percentage of people that will play at a professional level and make a living out of that sport, it's incredibly small. Yeah. It's in the single percentages of most sports that actually end up doing something on any ongoing basis with a sport professionally. So destroying them through 4 years of high school and college and another 4 years of college and maybe an attempt at some semi-pro or things like that, and creating these problems can set them up for trouble down the road. And so play the long game. You want to develop the athlete, you want to have success, but you also want to keep in mind that there's a cost.
Yeah. And when you're young, I don't think you think about that cost, and you don't think how it's going to affect you when you're 40, when you're 50. But yes, there is a cost. And if there is anyone listening to us around the age of 20, you're going to start feeling all those stupid things you've done before at some point, when it rains, when it's windy or anything.
Yeah. Youth forgives many things. And the ability to continue or persist in the presence of that stress that you're only recovering from because of some youthful benefit of hormonal profile and just youth. That ends. And some of those things you carry with you. So I think it's a pretty common refrain when you talk to a 50, 60-year-old who's trained for an extended period of time. What do you wish you'd known when you were starting out? And I'll answer for myself. It's patience. Play the long game. You don't need to peak today. You don't need to peak tomorrow. You can have time.
And build that pyramid where your top efforts are supported by a good foundation.
100%. So if we move from the general and start talking more specific, Well, that's up to the sport. And, you know, I was one of my students actually is heavily involved with the soccer team, and he was asking me, you know, where do we go, you know, from here? I'm helping from a distance with strength conditioning and stuff. And I said, what do they need to be better at?
Yeah.
Like, tell me, is it linear speed? Is it change of direction? Because if it's one of those, is it throw-ins? You know, you don't have a strong throw-in. I can help with those. It's like when golfers come to me, and I have swung a golf club. I do not claim to be a golfer. So I'm not going to coach golf technique. But when one of my students comes back to me and says, yeah, you know, my golf coach wants me to be able to turn more into my backswing. Got it. I can help you with. And oddly enough, it comes back to ankle, hip, and T-spine mobility to be able to make that turn. And so, got it. I can help you with that. It's the coach's job to apply that. So when I work with a coach or an athlete, I got to ask the question, what do you need to be better at? Because if we're working on change of direction, but you need linear speed, that's a problem. If you don't have the ability to produce a lot of force, looking at something like a broad jump, vertical leap, and I'm working on your stability, I'm not working on the weakest link, and only working on the weakest link will improve the chain and move things forward. So the conversation, once you start getting a little more specific, is what do you need to be better at? And that's usually a conversation between the athlete and the coach to identify, you know, an aspect of their performance that could be better. Then it's my job to sit there and say, okay, from an individual standpoint, this is what I need to work on. From a team standpoint, this is what I need to work on. Now, once you start drilling down and you start talking strategy and tactics, like that's in the hands of the coach. Like you still got to have a good coach. And I know, you know, from a strength conditioning standpoint, there's strength coaches that love to take all the credit for the success of a team. It's hard to find them when they're struggling and failing. But when they're successful, there's a few people that jump up out of the woodwork and want to claim that was because of what they did.
Or athletes in general, probably the sports specific training where they actually do the sport is probably the most important. The other aspects would be auxiliary supportive measures to support that skill development. Would you agree with that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that you know, and that's, if we look at soccer, you know, that's where short-sighted games and having the ball involved in the drills becomes really important, because this is where, even though you're trying to do it in a more structured way, this is where creativity, adaptation, you know, application of everything you've done off the pitch comes home when you start applying it on the pitch. And a good coach is going to set those situations up so that the strategy and tactics that they want to employ are optimized by the skills and drills that they're putting the athletes through. So it is a coordinated effort, and there should be those conversations between strength conditioning, medical, and coaching to say, okay, this is where we are. And, you know, that medical piece in the middle, and I place that in the middle, separating coaching and strength and conditioning on purpose, because that medical staff needs to be able to sit there and say, okay, look, I appreciate what you two want, but we got a lot of hamstring injuries right now. Talking from a team standpoint, what are we going to do about that? Because there's something that's happening or not being done that's making this a problem. And so those honest evaluations from an individual standpoint, like I said, what do I need to be better at? I'm not good at linear speed. Well, we can train that. And training linear speed comes back to make sure the movement baseline is good, make sure the strength levels are high enough, do some power work, and then apply it through something like sprinting, flying 10s, flying 20s, you know, things of that nature. So yeah, I think if that kind of approach and having that baseline in movement, strength, and power, combined with the honest evaluation of skills that might need to be improved, pretty good mix for most any athlete.
Mm-hmm. And I would like to pick your mind about also one other thing: metabolic adaptations for short and long endurance, short and long endurance sports. For example, jiu-jitsu, 6 minutes versus a marathon, hopefully 2.5 hours, sub 2.5 hours.
Yeah. What's an interesting dichotomy there, because even though jiu-jitsu is only a 6-minute round, it's highly glycolytic because of the amount of tension and work that's being done in that 6 minutes. Mm-hmm. Preventing somebody from choking you out, or leveraging one of your joints in the wrong direction is a pretty high intensity effort, and it's sustained for a longer period of time than, say, and so we'll contrast 3 different events: the 100-meter, 200-meter sprint, that jiu-jitsu round that you're talking about, and the marathon. Now, obviously, the odd person out there is the jiu-jitsu. It doesn't look like the other two. And it doesn't look like the other two because now we're dealing with a lot more muscular strength and sustained muscular effort. Mm-hmm. I think anybody that comes out of some of their first jiu-jitsu classes is similar to the person that comes out of their first experience on a climbing wall. And they're walking out and their hands are cramped up and they can't pick anything up because their forearms are done. Jiu-jitsu can be the same way. When you've cramped on to somebody's gi and you've been trying to not get choked out, you walk out and you're like, you're dead. So a muscular contraction, first off, inhibits blood flow. When you inhibit blood flow, you change what's happening from a metabolic standpoint within that muscle. Talk about this in the Iron Cardio book, and why, from an Iron Cardio standpoint, we keep the sets very brief, 3 to 5 reps only. It's about 10 to 15 seconds of work. We're alternating between kind of upper or lower body and ballistic, so I think we avoid some of the things that I'm getting ready to talk about. But under that sustained muscular contraction and effort, you go glycolytic very fast because you can't get air, aka oxygen, back into the muscles and have an exchange of waste products because the muscular contraction is decreasing or preventing blood flow. So you're really reliant on those local muscular endurance, local metabolic capacities to be able to produce energy and get back out of there. My friend Derek Toshner was telling the story when he was in college. They get the young kids come into the team, and he was a elite college sprinter, and so new kids would come in and they'd challenge him, 100 push-ups in 5 minutes. But what they would do is they'd get around the kid and they would encourage them to go as fast as possible. So they'd knock out the first 60 push-ups in like a minute, and a minute and a half. They couldn't finish the other 40 push-ups within the 5-minute time frame because the area was so pumped and so flooded with waste products that couldn't be cleared out, because now you have not only muscular tension preventing blood flow, you have metabolic waste products preventing blood flow and turnover of energy. And so you're done. So jiu-jitsu sits in that kind of weird middle time frame where we need to be able to have those periods of relaxation within the 6-minute round so that we can get blood flow back into those needed areas. But we also need to have built the capacity and the tolerance to be able to handle the stress that is coming within that 6-minute round. Now we look at 100-meter sprint, which hopefully is over in between 10 to 12 seconds, right? I don't think I've ever sniffed that, but that's because I'm slow. So in that 10 to 12 second effort, we're going to be primarily alactic or creatine phosphate system in what we're doing. So what I want to do is develop that ballpark 7 to 10 seconds of readily supplied energy that is efficiently turned over to produce that sprint. That's where my training wants to focus. Derek will also talk about, when he was training for track, they would run a 200 meters about every 15 minutes. So when you crank up the effort and you want to truly be powerful and truly sprint, you're not running a 200 meters every minute and a half.
Mm-hmm.
That's a puker that's designed to burn you out and flood the system with too much waste product. An elite sprinter that wants to get better at sprinting and improve their speed will run a sprint every 10 to 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in between, are they doing some stuff? Yeah. They're doing fast and loose drills. They're doing some other, low intensity drills to prepare them for the next sprint. And this is where we can get into a conversation of repeats versus intervals. Because when most people look at track, they start thinking intervals. I'm going to run the 400 meters in a minute and a half, and I'm going to do that every 3 minutes. So you're minute and a half on, minute and a half off. Good luck completing that 400 meters in a minute and a half after you've done a couple of those. You're going to burn out. To do a repeat, I would want to set the clock for a minute and a half and then rest long enough so that I can repeat that 400 meter effort in a minute and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And when I can no longer rest long enough to be able to repeat that effort at the same quality, I'm done for the day.
Mm-hmm.
So I start coming across the finish line at 135, even though I rested long enough to feel like I can hit the 130. That's it for the day.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really different approach, repeat versus interval.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the marathon runner, now we're talking about that aerobic system, which and energy system conversations are interesting because we like to think in silos. This is happening here, this is happening here, this is happening here. It's all happening at the same time, just to different degrees. So as soon as you start running, the aerobic system is starting to deploy. It just takes between 1 to 3 minutes, depending on the individual and how efficient they are, to get that aerobic system to fully deploy. Once the aerobic system is deployed and we have this nice efficient transfer of oxygen coming in, waste products going out, energy being produced within this aerobic system, which has a lower degree of waste products produced, we can sustain that for hours to days. The aerobic system is very long lasting. Mm-hmm. And if you're like me that has some extra energy within your body, aka body fat and carbohydrates, because I like to eat, you can sustain that for a very long period of time. So training for that marathon is still going to involve some sprinting, because in the end, even though you're running a marathon, it is a power event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
we're just not sprinting. Now, you look at the fact that the marathon champions now are knocking off 5-minute miles.
Mm-hmm. So that's very fast for long distance runner.
Yeah. So you want to apply that power to the ground very quickly, and not max effort. You're able to produce a quick jolt of power that gets you to the next step, but it's at a 30% level, because now you can sustain that for hours. If every step you're trying to drive 90% effort into the ground, that is a sprint. You only get to do that for a couple minutes at best, and even then, you're not really sprinting. You're just trying not to slow down. Past the first 20 seconds of a sprint, you're no longer, even in 100 meters, they'll reach peak speed after about 60 meters. Mm-hmm. They're just trying to hold on and not slow down for the last 40 meters. That's a 10-second effort.
Yeah.
So, lots of different things to get involved here. So the training, there's some similarities, but I'm definitely going to emphasize alactic and creatine phosphate system work for the sprinter. Definitely going to emphasize aerobic work, but still with power and intervals or repeats for the marathon runner. for the jiu-jitsu person, I'm going to work things that encourage good local muscular endurance, meaning metabolic efficiency, in those areas that are stressed during jiu-jitsu. Grip, arms, hips.
So, when you mentioned you want to rest for the sprints until you're fully recovered, that's muscular recovery. But how does neural recovery work in that time frame also?
Another huge aspect of why you want to rest way longer than you think you should, for things like sprinting and power work. Even for strength work, we talk about, if you're really doing strength training, probably 5 minutes of rest between sets. If I was doing, back when I was heavy barbell back squatting, I would rest 7-8 minutes between my heavier sets, which was great. Walk around the gym, chat with everybody, go back, do a couple reps, walk around for another 7 to 8 minutes. But yeah, the neurological recovery is huge there. And from an energy system standpoint, you'll recover about, and this sounds weird, but you'll recover about 2/3 of the energy in the first third of the rest. But the last third takes 2/3 longer to fully recover, which is why rest needs to be longer. And then, yeah, to your point, from a neurological standpoint, we got to give time for that neural recovery as well. And so that's why the rest periods get long. And that's also why, for most training, looking at repeats versus intervals is very effective, because when you can no longer repeat the effort, you should call it a day.
For strength training purposes.
Or intervals, or if I'm doing swings. So, or if I'm doing an iron cardio sequence, and I know that I'm knocking off a set every 30 seconds. And now it's every 40 seconds. I can no longer repeat the effort. I should call it a day.
I see.
Yeah.
So that is Really interesting. So how do you think it would work if we took an iron cardio, but we made it iron cardio session, but we made it so heavy that we wouldn't be able to repeat the lift, the set every minute, but we have to wait minutes in between each set? How do you think that would work out? Just as a
poorly, because now we've crossed over the line of now we're doing more pure strength training, and now we need 3 to 5 minute rest between those sets. The weight is heavy enough to where speed is going to, even though we're trying to accelerate it, speed is probably going to be a little less, and we want to have that quality effort every set. For the iron cardio sequence, we want to go heavy enough, but not too heavy. I still want my speed and my quality to stay really high, and I want my ability to repeat that effort to continue. So if you start crossing that line to where you're like, oof, yeah, I can only do one of these every 2.5 minutes, you're strength training. You're no longer doing iron cardio. And so that's the hybrid that iron cardio becomes. We're still getting good strength adaptations, but we're getting good metabolic adaptations. Talk about it in the book. The cardiovascular adaptations are there. Some of them are peripheral, meaning we're getting capillarization and blood flow and metabolic efficiency in the musculature. The true cardiovascular adaptations are impacted by the pressure load and the volume load. So again, we talked about it from the jiu-jitsu standpoint. When you produce muscular tension, you reduce blood flow. Well, you also reduce the amount of blood coming back into the heart. So when you look at something like running, what you see is the muscular pumping and rhythm of the effort and the impact is actually helping move blood back to the heart. So what you get is a lot of blood coming back in. We get this nice stretch of the left ventricle. We get this nice contraction and push of the strong contraction of the left ventricle. That gives us a pliable and strong left ventricle. When you try to do all of your cardiovascular adaptations via heavy strength training, and again, I think iron cardio avoids this, but let's say we're doing sets of 10 in the squat with a pretty a heavy weight. That sustained muscular contraction and reduction of blood flow that's coming back to the heart means now we have this super strong contraction by the left ventricle to pump through the pressure, but we don't have as much blood filling the chamber. So what we get is a stiff. We get left ventricle hypertrophy. The left ventricle gets bigger and thicker, but less pliable. And so now, even when we do some cardiovascular training and we're trying to push more blood into that left ventricle, there's no stretch to allow it. And so, yes, your heart rate will go up as a result of strength training. And this is where exercise physiologists and people will caution you, just because your heart rate went up doesn't mean you're doing real cardiovascular training. And so, again, I think the iron cardio sequence avoids this because the way the length of effort, the changing of exercises and ballistics within the sequence, the rest in between, and things of that nature. But I still go for walks. I still try to do some zone 2 work on an elliptical. I go hiking. Like, I'm doing other forms of cardiovascular training to get that pliable and strong left ventricle.
That's a very interesting point that you made about the enlarged and not pliable left ventricle, and that was something that I have not thought about before, and so I think it's very interesting. And thanks a lot, Brett, for the chat today. We went into detail about how different forms of training can affect different sports and how different energy systems and how to train them. And it's been a very, very fun and very it's been a very fun conversation with you today. And thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mert. And I look forward to the next one.
See you in the next episode.